This year, we celebrate the centenary of the Kilmichael ambush, one of the most important events to take place during the War of Independence. While the popular ballad is still widely sang, the context in which that engagement took place and its impact on the struggle overall is often overlooked and even sometimes ignored. While the death on hunger strike of Cork City Lord Mayor volunteer Terence McSweeney and the execution of the young 18-year-old Kevin Barry, the Irish conflict was gaining international attention. Concerned by criticism from abroad and fearing that insurrection in Ireland would encourage imitation in the other colonies, Britain was determined to crush resistance here. As was the practice across the Empire and under the guise of restoring law and order, London was pursuing a strategy of counter-insurgency and terror. Central to this policy was the deployment of the Special Constables and an auxiliary division, better known, as we all know, as the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. To analyse and explain this in more detail, we are pleased and delighted to have the input of a young Cork political activist, Graham Harrington. Graham begins by setting out the context as he outlines events in the lead up to the famous engagement.
The final months of 1920 saw an escalation of the war for independence in Ireland and also Britain's response to the struggle. As elsewhere in the Empire, the British resorted to terror in an attempt to crush resistance to its rule. September 1920 witnessed the sacking of Balbriggan as a reprisal for the shooting dead of a high-ranking police officer. In October, the iconic Republican fighting man Sean Tracy, who had participated in the famous solo headbag ambush that effectively launched the Black and Tan War, was shot dead in Dublin by British forces. Not long afterwards, the world watched in horror and indeed fascination as Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney, died on hunger strike in Brixton Prison. November 1920 began with a no less shocking event, for the Irish at least, with the execution by hanging of 18-year-old Kevin Barry in Dublin's Mountjoy prison. It's worth noting that Barry's execution was the first Republican activist to face capital punishment since the deaths of the Republican leadership in the days after the 1916 Easter Rising. The young man had been captured in the aftermath of an armed attack on a number of British troops during which 2 soldiers had died. By executing an armed combatant, the British authorities had made a statement that they did not recognise the conventional rules of war and were actually attempting to apply judicial practice to a political problem. November 21st also saw the IRA attack and largely dismantle British intelligence networks in Dublin during a coordinated series of strikes across the city. By way of reprisal, Crown forces, including detachments of the RIC, launched an attack on spectators and players in Croke Park, killing 14 people and wounding many others. Later that evening, 3 captured members of the IRA, Peadar Clancy, Conor Clune, and Dick McKee, were murdered while in British military custody.
Graham now introduces us to the auxiliaries and their methods. In that period, they acted as Britain's special counter-insurgency force, much or the same as the special air services of today.
As elsewhere and as in other eras, the British authorities of the time were attempting to portray the conflict not as a colonial struggle, but rather as a law and order issue to which they would apply policing and judicial countermeasures. As British Prime Minister Lloyd George had said in the House of Commons, this was a policeman's job supported by the military and not vice versa. Central to this process was their use of the Royal Irish Constabulary along with its 2 contingents of reinforcements. First being Special Constabularies, widely known as the Black and Tans, and the second tranche of recruits, the Auxiliary Division of the RIC. This latter group, usually referred to simply as the Auxiliaries or the Auxies, were seen by the British as an elite force, recruited almost exclusively from former officers of the British military. Many were decorated war veterans, and all of them were practiced in the use of arms. They were by no means police officers in any conventional understanding of the concept, nor was that ever the intention of the British government. They were introduced to Ireland as a military counterinsurgency group or a special forces detachment. They were highly paid mercenaries, earning what was for the time the princely sum of £1 per day, heavily armed, self-contained, and largely answering only to their immediate superiors. Whatever other claims the British made then or since, the intention was to use the auxiliary division to dragoon the Irish population into submission. The auxiliaries set about their task with enthusiasm, quickly earning a reputation for brutality and terrorising entire districts. There was little restraint on their behaviour, and they displayed little restraint wherever they went. There grew around them an aura and myth of invincibility that led to a situation where in many areas, including County Cork, Republicans hesitated to engage them in military operations. To that extent, they were achieving what they had been sent to Ireland to do. That is until 28 November 1920, when a convoy of auxiliaries travelling on the road from Macroom to Dunmanway were intercepted by Tom Barry's West Cork flying column.
To engage with this well-armed, highly trained group of British Special Forces was Tom Barry's flying column, and now Graham gives us an insight into how the IRA unit was armed and prepared for the battle.
On 21 November 1920, Tom Barry mobilised 35 members of the IRA with the intention of ambushing a patrol of the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The West Cork flying column of the IRA was armed with an assortment of weapons, as was the norm with volunteers of the time. Lee Enfield rifles captured from the British Army, Canadian Ross rifles taken from the Coast Guard, and a collection of revolvers, shotguns, and a small number of hand grenades. Each man was issued with 35 rounds of ammunition. Although well armed by the standard of IRA units of the time, they were desperately short of ammunition in the case of a lengthy firefight. Moreover, the column did not have any fully automatic general-purpose machine guns in the event of a prolonged engagement with regular forces. Tom Barry, with experience of service in the First World War, was only too well aware of this fact, but was prepared to take a calculated risk in order to accomplish a remarkable feat. That was the defeat of a section of Britain's counterinsurgency special forces.
Yet, and in spite of the auxiliaries' combat experience, the IRA in Cork had identified a mistake being made by those auxiliaries based in Macroom.
The flying column's target was a patrol of C Company of the Auxiliary Division based at Macroom Castle. As with detachments of their auxiliaries elsewhere, C Company had wreaked havoc on the civilian community of West Cork with a brutal campaign of torture and murder. Having met until then with little resistance from the local IRA, the auxiliaries had grown arrogant and contemptuous, and thus careless. Believing that they had gained the upper hand by intimidating Republicans in the area, they made the fatal mistake of setting a pattern to their movements.
Tom Barry understood only too well the challenge his men would encounter. Wait for the very formidable foe and the harsh physical and climate conditions.
With his expert eye for terrain, Barry picked a sharp bend on what is now the R587 as a location for the ambush in the townland of Kilmichael. The ambush site was chosen so fire could be opened at point-blank range. Although suitable for the engagement, the spot created other difficulties for the column. The surrounding ground was marshy, and rising close to the roadway were rocky slopes that afforded some elevation with little cover and less opportunity for retreat. Since the site offered no opportunity for a safe evacuation for the volunteers, it was kill or be killed. Barry later wrote that he envisaged a fight to the death with the auxiliaries, and as he said, the positions that the IRA were about to occupy allowed of no retreat. The alternative was now to kill or be killed. See to it that these terrorists die and are broken. The flying column marched in pouring rain through the winter night to the ambush point. Their clothes had been drenched, and as they waited, they had to endure long and uncomfortable hours. Barry described the cold as biting. They had had no food since the day before, apart from a bucket of tea sent down by a local household. They lay in wait throughout the day and were chilled to the bone by the late afternoon when their scouts raised the alert that 2 lorry loads of the auxiliaries were coming. It was about 4:30 p.m. on that cold November day.
We now hear of the ferocious engagement that took place and a significant victory won, but let's say at a cost.
Barry had divided the column into 6 squads. 4 teams comprised 2 L-shaped ambushes. That is, one squad facing the enemy force as they approached a bend and the other pouring in fire from the flanks. They were concealed in the rocky hills very close to the side of the road. 6 riflemen was kept in reserve at a point from which they could fire on both ambush sites. 3 unarmed scouts stood watch at the approaches to the site. Tom Barry had dressed himself in an Irish Volunteers uniform which, to those unfamiliar with that organisation, looked at a distance to be a British officer's uniform. Taking a huge risk, he stuck out into the road, waving down the approaching enemy. Thus, when the first lorry load of auxiliaries saw what they believed to be a British officer, they slowed their vehicle, giving Barry the opportunity to lob a hand grenade into the open cab. A group of IRA riflemen were positioned in close proximity and immediately opened intensive fire into the disabled lorry. In a matter of minutes, the 9 auxiliaries travelling in the first lorry, including commanding officer Francis Craig, were dead. It had been a brutal encounter at close quarters. As Barry recounted in his memoirs, revolvers were used at point-blank range, and at times rifle butts replaced rifle shots. So close were the combatants that in one instance the pumping blood from an auxiliary's severed artery struck one attacker full in the mouth. In less than 5 minutes they were all dead or dying, sprawled around the road near the little stone wall. If the fighting to disable the occupants of the first lorry had been intense, the battle with the second lorry's personnel was utterly ferocious. Alerted by the attack on the first lorry, many auxiliaries in the second vehicle had managed to dismount and take up firing positions in the ditches either side of the road. Accounts from surviving members of the IRA tell of desperate, close-quarter, hand-to-hand combat. Rifle butts, bayonets, and revolvers were used. One man reported that blood from his head wound jammed his rifle bolt, causing him to lift a dead comrade's weapon in order to continue fighting. It was at this stage that some of the auxiliaries called out that they wanted to surrender. As a group of IRA, including 16-year-old Pat Deasy, approached to accept the surrender, shooting again broke out from within the besieged auxiliaries, causing death and injury among the surrounding volunteers. As a consequence of this treachery, Tom Barry issued the order that there would be no quarter given and no subsequent attempt to surrender would be accepted. When the firing stopped, 17 auxiliaries were dead and the IRA had lost 3 men, Tim Sullivan, Mick McCarthy and young Pat Deasy. While Tom Barry was an experienced soldier and veteran of World War I, the same could not be said for the men under his command. They were locally recruited volunteers that had shown extreme courage and discipline under very trying circumstances. However, for the majority of them, this was the first time they had seen combat and were understandably stressed. To steady and steel his men, Barry then ordered the column to carry out foot drill on the side of the fighting and only then gave the command to begin the retreat, carrying with them the precious cargo of rifles, revolvers and ammunition taken from the auxiliaries. They also took with them the bodies of their dead comrades and buried them in temporary graves. After a lengthy march in cold and driving rain, the flying column reached the relative safety of a camp in Grenor before midnight on 28 November 1920. On the following day, British soldiers accompanied other auxiliaries to the ambush site and retrieved the bodies of the dead. They also carried out reprisals on the local community, burning farmhouses and outbuildings.
Graham concludes his exploration and analysis of that historic occasion with an insightful assessment of its impact on the outcome.
The impact of the Kilmichael ambush on Britain's policy for Ireland was much greater than the loss of 17 members of the Special Counterinsurgency Unit. In the first instance, it cracked the myth of invincibility that had until then surrounded that division of the Crown's forces in Ireland. No longer would they hold the same fear for Republican Ireland, and no longer, therefore, could they fulfil the purpose Britain had designed for them. Moreover, it also meant that Britain could no longer effectively depend on a quasi-policing strategy for dealing with Ireland. Although London's use of the Black and Tans and then the auxiliaries could not by any recognised interpretation be defined as conventional policing practice, it afforded the British government some prospect of containing the situation. Thereafter, the only option remaining was to flood the country with regular troops, a situation that was both politically and militarily fraught with risk. Sending great numbers of Tommies into a revolutionary situation when the Bolshevik Revolution was still fresh in the public conscience was not a realistic prospect for the British ruling class. They had, after all, watched with alarm the huge numbers of people, including many English, who had stood in London along the route taken by Terence MacSwiney's funeral cortege as it travelled from Brixton Prison. The British recognised that a new and different strategy had to be developed that would split the insurgents along class lines. But that's another story. For the time being, and thanks to the boys of Kilmichael, the Republic was in the ascendancy.
Forget not the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. On the 28th day of November, the Tans left the town of Macroom. They were armed in 2 Crosley tenders, which brought them right into their doom. They were on the road to Kilmichael and never expected to stall, till they met with the boys of the column who made a queen sweep of them all. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. The sun in the west it was sinking, 'twas the eve of a cold winter's day, when the clans we were wearily waiting came into the spot where we lay, and over the hill went the echo, the peal of the rifle and gun, and the flames from the glories gave tidings that the boys of the column had won. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. The lorries were ours before twilight, and high over Dunmanway town, the sun in the still air was gleaming to show that the Tans had gone down. We gathered our rifles and bayonets and soon left the glen so obscure, and never drew rail till we halted at the faraway camp in Granure. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. Forget not the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue.
Very good.